Welcome to The Untold Story, everybody. I'm Martha McCallum. Great to have all of you with us. And today I'm very glad to be joined by Free Press columnist Eli Lake. And we spoke earlier this week, Eli and I, about what's going on at CBS. And I want to bring him right in. So, Eli, thanks again for joining me. Great to have you with us.
So great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So they really are going through kind of a crazy period at CBS where they're being challenged, I think, understandably, on a couple of fronts. And I want to address the first one first, which was when Tony Dokoupil and Ta-Nehisi Coates, who many people will remember as the author who kind of, I think, really got the conversation rolling about systemic racism in the United States. And now he has a new book out that he said he wanted to approach from the Palestinian perspective. And when he went on CBS's morning show and spoke with Tony Dokoupil about it, who's one of their morning anchors, it sort of took a turn, I guess you could say. It seems like a logical turn, during which Tony started to ask him why he ignored the Israeli perspective in his writing and in his work in this book. And here's that exchange. Let's play that.
It's what I struggled with throughout this book. What is it that so particularly offends you about the existence of a Jewish state that is a Jewish safe place and not any of the other states out there?
There's nothing that offends me about a Jewish state. I am offended by the idea of states built on ethnocracy, no matter where they are.
So anything wrong with that conversation in your mind, Eli, in terms of their discussion?
Well, Israel, you could argue, was an ethnocracy until about 1965, 1966, and then Arab Israelis got full equal citizenship. The government before this current government, with Netanyahu as the prime minister, had for the first time an Arab party in the ruling coalition. You will find Arabs on the Supreme Court of Israel, Arab doctors, Arabs participate in Israeli society. They do not have to serve compulsory. There isn't a compulsion for Arabs to serve in the military, but there are plenty of Druze and other non-Jewish Israelis who do serve in the Israel Defense Forces. So the idea that Israel is as an ethnocracy is wrong. I think what Ta-Nehisi Coates is referring to is the condition of Palestinians who live on the West Bank and in Gaza. Now, these are the territories that in the 1990s, there was a great push to have a two-state solution, and those would be, largely speaking, the territories that would be part of a two-state solution. There is a Palestinian Authority that rules in the West Bank, and Hamas, though it's greatly diminished today after a year after October 7th, is the sovereign of Gaza. The Israeli military will go into the West Bank, but they do it with not just the tacit, but the really explicit understanding of the Palestinian Authority to go after terrorist groups. And Hamas is a terrorist group, so obviously Israel doesn't cooperate with Hamas in Gaza, or didn't before. But after October 7th, which was a gruesome massacre and an act of war, the hostilities began in Gaza. Hezbollah joined the conflict. Obviously, we know the whole story, and then that's why we're seeing now the conflict in Lebanon. But the idea that Israel is this ethnocracy is, in my view, a very kind of tortured reading of the situation, and doesn't, in that assessment, it doesn't. There's no agency for the fact that Palestinian leaders since 1936-37 with the Peel Commission have rejected time and again offers for partition, or what we now call a two-state solution.
So all of what we're talking about and what you're explaining in more depth, which is extremely helpful, is part of the conversation to be had around this subject, except that CBS News did not want this conversation to happen on their air. And in fact, one of their executives had said, Mark Memmott, back in August, that he sent around an email reminding employees when he was talking about how we'll handle our coverage on the issue, very hot issue of what's happening in Israel and in Gaza, he was referring to. He said not to refer to Jerusalem as being in Israel, which is a bizarre comment. I don't know if he misspoke, and what he was saying was don't refer to it as the capital, but he according to what we have from his quote, said don't refer to Jerusalem as being in Israel. This whole thing blew up. They had meetings all over CBS about the fact that Dokoupil had challenged Ta-Nehisi Coates at all. Essentially, like, why did you draw him out? Why did you challenge him? He's supposed to get some sort of free pass on this show. And, it was an extraordinary moment that I think is still playing out. There were tears at CBS among some of the staffers over this whole thing. Why can't they have this conversation? Isn't that what journalism is really all about? What are they so nervous about, Eli?
Well, you nailed it. That is what journalism is about. It's about challenging people and having, if you're interviewing somebody, you should challenge them, especially if they're giving a one-sided perspective. So there's a couple things going on here. Let's address the first thing. That has nothing to do with Israel. It has to do with America, and it has to do specifically with the younger generation that are coming into newsrooms, but also other areas, of our economy that kind of believe that if they're made to feel uncomfortable, that is, cause for almost rebellion. And that is the opposite of how I was trained in the news business, and I would imagine how you were trained in the news business, which is that it's good to have our feelings and our assumptions and our predispositions challenged, and that sometimes in order to learn, one must feel uncomfortable. And so there's something there that is really kind of part of, it's a culture of safety-ism. And that's itself a problem. And it manifested itself in terms of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But it would manifest itself in other ways. We've seen, on racial issues. This is very similar to when the New York Times 4 years ago ran an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton that expressed a point of view that a lot of Americans believed on an op-ed page that sort of touts itself as a place where there is a free exchange of ideas. And the idea that you would platform this perspective was many members of the newsroom, much to my shock and chagrin, said that it was literally causing them to be physically unsafe, that it was endangering reporters of color. And this is the end of journalism if we are to accept this kind of consensus, or that you can make this sort of appeal. But I would also say that it reveals another thing, which is very specific to Israel-Palestine, which is there's a double standard, which is to say that, just as sort of a hypothetical, what if there was a Jewish, very Zionistic young millennial in the CBS, or young Gen Z in the CBS newsroom, who felt by platforming this incredibly one-sided, narrative, and the author of that narrative that demonizes Israel, that they felt unsafe? Well, we all know the answer. That those feelings of unsafety are, irrelevant.
Yeah.
Okay. The only kind of unsafety that matters are the people who think that Ta-Nehisi Coates is, some sort of almost religious prophet. Now, so I think it tells us a couple things. The first thing is the whole idea that if you're feeling uncomfortable, that you have, especially in a place like a newsroom, that you have some sort of recourse and you can go to management and bring in HR and various kinds of DEI consultants, is a model that we ought to move away from. I think it's led us down a pretty bad path, and I think it's threatening to journalism itself. But the sort of secondary point is that this sort of DEI hierarchy of those who are oppressed, or hierarchy of victims, there's no place for the Jewish people, which historically have been, on the wrong end of the stick for most of the history of civilization. So it's a double whammy in some ways. One is this very American idea that we have to, I think, fight against intellectually, which is against the idea of safety-ism. And then the other is a recognition that this new hierarchy, this new, what sometimes is called intersectionality, has no place for the most oppressed people in the history of peoples,
Well,
Jewish people.
And one of the issues that I see is that the executives need to have some spine on this. They need to push back,
yes.
and they need to say to these younger individuals, in many cases, who experienced this in the same way in college, that if anything ruffled their feathers or made them uncomfortable, they would get their way on this, right? And that they're trying to carry that into the workplace. And you know, I mean, I remember my early days of writing as a reporter. I was working in the financial journalism area at that time. And I got, you know, the pieces that I wrote stepped all over all the time and, you know, sent back to begin again. And, you know, this doesn't work. You're not substantiating these arguments on both sides. All of this, which is how I learned my job. And so, you know, absent of that, I'm not sure how they are ever going to get to a place of being real journalists. I want to ask you a little bit about this 60 Minutes blow up as well, which is also on CBS's doorstep this week. Let's play these two sound bites, one of which CBS used to promote the Kamala Harris 60 Minutes interview, but they played it on Sunday morning. On their Sunday morning show as a tease. And then the second part that you will hear, listeners at home or in your car or wherever, is going to be what actually aired on 60 Minutes. You'll hear the same question from Bill Whitaker, who I think did a respectable job in this interview, but we're trying to figure out what happened in the edit room. So let's listen to both of these.
But it seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not listening.
Well, Bill, the work that we have done has resulted in a number of movements in that region by Israel that were very much prompted by or a result of many things, including our advocacy for what needs to happen in the region.
But it seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not listening.
We're not going to stop pursuing what is necessary for the United States to be clear about where we stand on the need for this war to end.
Well, obviously, number two is the better answer. It was edited different ways. What do you think? And now the latest news on this is that former CBS staffers are calling for an outside probe of 60 Minutes of this interview amid this editing scandal, which has President Trump, former President Trump, up in arms, and others as well. What do you think needs to happen here? What can CBS do to rectify this in the proper way?
Well, I'm going to give you I do think that there's an answer, but I don't know what CBS can do. What I can tell you is we're already seeing a new media landscape. I would argue that your network, Fox, my outlet, the Free Press, we are the winners when you see moments like this that are so self-discrediting for the major networks. We no longer live in an America where CBS was the center of sort of objectivity in the news business.
The Walter Cronkite version, yeah.
Exactly. It's no longer the Tiffany network. And the idea that CBS is going to regain that pole position, I don't know that they can do it. And so what I think you saw, you know, you can go one of two ways. You can try to restore some of the objectivity and balance that news as opposed to opinion would demand. And I think you could look at CNN. I think CNN is a much better this election cycle than it certainly was in 2020. Or you can go the route of MSNBC, which is basically a full-on partisan propaganda outlet on behalf of the Democratic Party. And, the irony is that this used to be the sort of liberal critique of Fox. But I would say, as somebody who watches Fox, that Fox does a much better job of trying to kind of give you on their news programs, here's what happened, and without the kind of spin. And I think that's one of the reasons why Fox continues to have much better ratings than these traditional networks. Ultimately, the market will answer this question. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons why Free Press is growing is because people see this kind of thing. It's a really glaring and egregious example with 60 Minutes. And in some ways, I think the combination of these two stories, the editorial guidance about Jerusalem, there was a recent thing that we broke, or Barry Weiss, our editor, broke, yesterday, which is that right after October 7th, there was a memo that went out that sort of said, be careful of what you call a terrorist attack. Some people would have a disagreement. I mean, are you serious? Mm-hmm. If October 7th is a terrorist attack, then there's no such thing. I think when you see something like that, though, is that, who's going to be left, who's going to kind of trust these networks? And it's a shame because I think we both know that there are very good journalists. I mean, we should say that the reporting on the call about Tony Dokoupil, not just Tony Dokoupil, but Jan Crawford, who covers the courts for CBS, really pushed back, probably, at some risk, given the fact that, the top brass at CBS News was sort of all on one page. So we shouldn't always paint with such a broad brushstroke, but these are institutional decisions that maybe don't understand it, but there are a lot of alternatives for Americans who just want to get the news.
The Untold Story continues right after this.
I think that's why you see former CBS staffers wanting an outside probe, because they see what has happened to the institution that they used to call home and take pride in, and they're not happy about that.
By the way, the answer is not to then do a jump cut edit of an interview with Trump or J.D. Vance. The answer is to stop doing dishonest editing when you're doing these interviews, and to own it that you did that. I mean, and the fact is that you did it for everybody to see. It's not arguable at this point. I don't need.
And they need to put out the entire transcript.
In journalism
and
to tell me that.
Do stem to stern and show this is what happened from the minute she walked in and we sat down. This is the whole thing. We all understand that things need to be cut for time, and this is very inside baseball, but there are ethics about the way you shorten something, and you can't shorten it in a way that makes the person look better or worse, or in a way that pulls up their sentences to clean up what happened in between. And these were not followed. There's other examples in that interview. When the first time I watched it, my jaw dropped. I was just at home going, wait, that's a cut. That's a cut. That's a cut. All in one answer, that was about 30 seconds long. So it is extraordinary. But before I run out of time, I want to ask you about your new piece, The Spy Who Lied to Us, which digs into Christopher Steele, a name that I think a lot of people haven't heard for a little while, but the Steele dossier was the central part of the Russia scandal back in the 2016 presidential race. And his book is called Unredacted, Russia, Trump and the Fight for Democracy. What do you make of this effort on the part of this Christopher Steele?
There is a Yiddish word, chutzpah, which just means unbelievable nerve.
Yes.
And I can't understand why this guy, I mean, if there's one thing, even people who still want to say, which I think is wrong, and the evidence is overwhelmingly against it, that there was some shady dealings between Trump and Russia in 2016, they will always throat clear and say, well, the Steele dossier is a straw man. That's a dodge because, all right, we know that was wrong, but there was so much other stuff, which is also not true, but let's leave that aside. Here's the guy who is responsible for this enormous hoax that wasted, I'm trying to quantify it. I mean, it wasted so much resources from the FBI.
People went to jail.
People, and our time in the media. I'm just, and this has been, as a journalist, something that I have written a lot about over the years. I think this is really the episode where you started to see this word self-discrediting of the mainstream media, which is that they fell hook, line, and sinker on this story, and there was nothing there. And when we kind of peel back the onion over time, thanks to people like John Durham and Michael Horowitz at the Inspector General at the Justice Department, what we found is that this was started as a project that was paid for by the Hillary Clinton campaign to basically tarnish Trump with this sort of Russia connection. And here's the guy who instrumentalized all of it, saying that he was right all along and not really addressing what I think are kind of bulletproof arguments from the Justice Department itself about how he had snowed them. And so we'll see what the reception is to this book. I think I'm one of the first reviews out, but I would really like to know, if he makes the rounds and MSNBC interviews him and treats him like he's a serious intelligence analyst now or something like that, I mean, that'll tell us, it'll confirm what we already knew about that network.
Yeah, it's a great piece. Very interesting, called The Spy Who Lied to Us, by Eli Lake at the Free Press, which is a great publication and a great morning newsletter that everybody should have in their daily briefing when you open your phone in the morning. Eli, it's always good to talk to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon. That's the Untold Story for today. I'm Martha McCallum. You've been listening to The Untold Story with Martha McCallum. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Make sure to rate and review. For more podcasts, go to foxnewspodcast.com. Listen ad-free with the Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.